The salt spray hit Jake's face as his boat cut through the choppy waters toward Ravens Point Island. 22 years old, raised in the Colorado mountains, he'd never even seen the ocean until 3 days ago when his grandfather's lawyer handed him the deed. The old man had been a mystery, disappearing for months at a time, returning with pockets full of cash and stories that never quite added up. Now Jake understood why. The barn dominated the island's center, massive and windowless, built like a fortress. His grandfather's note had been simple: trust no one. The barn holds everything. Destroy it all if they come. Jake's hands shook as he approached the electronic lock, military grade, completely out of place on a supposedly abandoned island. Inside, rows of computers hummed quietly, their screens displaying shipping routes, bank accounts, and encrypted files marked classified. His grandfather hadn't been a simple mountain hermit. He'd been running something big, something dangerous. The distant sound of helicopter rotors made Jake's blood freeze. What had his grandfather been hiding, and why were armed men already heading for the island? Jake's fingers flew over the keyboard, muscle memory from his computer science courses taking over despite his panic. The screens showed names he recognized from news reports: politicians, CEOs, foreign officials, bank transfers in the millions, shipping manifests for cargo that didn't match the listed destinations. His grandfather had been trafficking something, but what? The helicopter sound grew louder, and Jake could see it through a gap in the barn's wall, black, unmarked, military style. His mountain instincts kicked in. In Colorado, when a storm hit, you found shelter fast or you died. This felt exactly the same. He grabbed a flash drive from his pocket and started copying files, hands trembling as progress bars crawled across multiple screens. The first folder contained financial records spanning decades. The second held photographs of shipping containers being loaded at night, faces obscured but locations clearly marked. The third made his stomach drop. Children, dozens of them, all young, all looking terrified. Jake's grandfather hadn't been trafficking drugs or weapons. He'd been documenting human trafficking. The old man had been some kind of undercover agent, or maybe a whistleblower gathering evidence. The cash, the mysterious trips, the paranoia. It all made horrible sense now. The helicopter was directly overhead now, and Jake could hear rappelling gear hitting the barn's roof. His grandfather's final words echoed in his mind: destroy it all if they come. But these files could save lives, hundreds of lives. A red button sat under a protective case near the main server bank, labeled simply Purge. Jake's grandfather had built in a kill switch. Boots thundered on the metal roof above. Jake's flash drive showed 60% complete on the file transfer. Not enough time. He spotted a second computer terminal in the corner, this one displaying a different interface entirely. A communications system. His grandfather had been feeding information to someone. The last logged contact was just 2 days ago, after his grandfather's death. Jake clicked the message thread. The contact was listed only as Phoenix. Cardinal Wise, compromised, package secure, awaiting extraction. That was his grandfather's final message. Phoenix had responded yesterday. New contact inbound. Trust the mountain boy. They knew about him. Somehow, Phoenix knew Jake would be here. The barn's main door exploded inward with a deafening crash. 3 figures in tactical gear swept in, assault rifles raised. Jake dove behind the server bank just as bullets began chewing through the equipment around him. "Where's the mountain boy?" one of them shouted. "Command wants him alive if possible." Jake's flash drive beeped. Transfer complete. He yanked it free and shoved it deep into his boot, the same way he'd hidden snacks from bears while camping. Mountain boys learned to protect what mattered. "Come out, kid," another voice called. "We just want to talk. Your grandfather stole something that belongs to us." Jake's hand hovered over the purge button. These weren't federal agents. Federal agents would have identified themselves, shown badges, tried negotiation first. These were the people his grandfather had been hiding from. A grenade clattered across the concrete floor. Jake slammed the purge button and rolled toward what looked like a maintenance hatch in the barn's floor. The grenade exploded just as the servers began their systematic destruction, filling the air with smoke and sparks. The hatch led to a tunnel system his grandfather had carved into the island's rock foundation. Classic paranoid preparation, but Jake was grateful for the old man's thoroughness. Emergency supplies lined the walls: food, water, weapons, and communication equipment. At the tunnel's end, Jake found a hidden boat dock carved into the island's north face. A small speedboat waited, keys dangling from the ignition. His grandfather had planned for this exact scenario. As Jake fired up the engine, he could hear explosions from the barn above. They were making sure nothing survived. But they were wrong. Jake had the evidence. Now he just had to figure out how to contact Phoenix and stay alive long enough to expose the truth. The speedboat shot into the dark ocean as Ravens Point Island burned behind him. The morning sun cast long shadows across the weathered dock as Jake stepped off the ferry, his duffel bag slung over one shoulder and a manila envelope containing the island's deed clutched in his free hand. The ferry captain, a grizzled man named Murphy, who'd introduced himself with a grunt and suspicious glare, was already untying the mooring lines. "You sure about this, son?" Murphy called out, his voice barely audible over the engine's rumble. "Ain't nobody been out to Gull's Rest in near 2 years. Place has a way of unsettling folks." Jake waved him off, though something in the old man's tone made his stomach tighten. "I'll be fine. Just need to look the place over, maybe clean it up some." Murphy shook his head and throttled up the engine. "Radio's in the house if you need help, though whether anyone'll answer." His words were lost as the ferry churned away from the dock, leaving Jake alone on the narrow strip of beach. The island stretched before him like something from a forgotten postcard. Dense pine forests climbed the central hills, while rocky outcroppings jutted from the shoreline like ancient sentinels. A narrow path wound up from the dock through tall grass that whispered in the salt breeze. Jake had expected to feel some connection to this place his grandfather had loved, but instead he felt only an odd sense of being watched. The house sat in a clearing halfway up the main hill, a modest 2-story structure with cedar shingles silvered by years of coastal weather. It was smaller than Jake had imagined, with a wraparound porch and windows that reflected the morning sky like blank eyes. Behind it, partially hidden by a stand of spruce trees, loomed the barn that had dominated his grandfather's stories. Jake dropped his bag on the porch and tried the front door. Locked, but the key was exactly where the lawyer had said it would be, under the third loose board. The hinges protested with a screech that sent seabirds wheeling overhead. Inside, dust motes danced in shafts of sunlight streaming through salt-stained windows. The furniture was covered in white sheets that gave the rooms a ghostly quality. Everything smelled of brine and abandonment. Jake moved through the kitchen, noting the old-fashioned wood stove and hand-pumped well water. Living here would mean stepping back 50 years. But it was the view from the back window that made him pause. The barn dominated the landscape, easily 3 times larger than the house. Its red paint had faded to the color of dried blood, and the massive sliding doors were secured with not 1, but 3 heavy padlocks. For a building supposedly filled with farming equipment, it seemed remarkably well secured. Jake found himself walking toward it despite having planned to settle into the house first. The grass around the barn was shorter, as if someone had been maintaining it. Fresh tire tracks marked the earth near the doors, though Murphy had insisted no one visited the island anymore. The first thing he noticed was the humming. Low and barely perceptible, it seemed to come from within the barn itself. Jake pressed his ear to the weathered wood, and the sound became clearer. Electrical equipment, maybe generators or ventilation systems. Hardly what he'd expect from a building storing old tractors and hay balers. He walked the perimeter looking for another way in and found something that made his blood run cold. Cameras. Small, modern units mounted at each corner, their lenses tracking his movement with mechanical precision. One winked with a tiny red light, indicating it was recording. "What the hell, Grandpa?" Jake muttered, backing away from the barn. His grandfather had been a simple lobsterman and part-time farmer. The most high-tech thing he'd owned was a marine radio from the 1980s. A sound made him spin around, the distant rumble of a boat engine. Jake jogged back toward the house, grabbing a pair of binoculars he'd spotted on the kitchen table. From the porch he could see a sleek powerboat cutting through the swells about a mile out. It was moving fast, heading directly for the island. The boat was too far away to make out details, but something about its purposeful approach sent alarm bells ringing in Jake's head. He thought about Murphy's warning, about the fresh tire tracks, about cameras watching a supposedly abandoned barn. Jake grabbed his grandfather's old hunting rifle from above the mantel, thankfully still loaded, and positioned himself at a window with a clear view of the dock. The boat was closer now, maybe 10 minutes out. He could see at least 2 figures aboard, one of them pointing toward the island. His phone showed no signal, and the radio Murphy had mentioned was an ancient unit that might or might not work. Jake was alone on an island that clearly held secrets someone thought worth protecting with surveillance equipment, and uninvited guests were approaching fast. Whatever his grandfather had been involved in, whatever was hidden in that barn, Jake was about to become part of it, whether he wanted to or not. The morning sun cast long shadows across the island as Jake approached the barn with renewed determination. Sleep had been elusive, his mind churning over the events of the previous day. The mysterious phone call, the warning about staying away from the barn, and most puzzling of all, his grandfather's apparent deception about the island's true nature. He'd spent the early hours exploring the cabin more thoroughly, searching for any clues his grandfather might have left behind. Hidden beneath a loose floorboard in the bedroom, he'd discovered a small metal box containing old photographs and a journal wrapped in oiled cloth. The photos showed his grandfather as a much younger man, standing alongside people Jake didn't recognize in what appeared to be some kind of laboratory setting. The journal was written in his grandfather's familiar handwriting, but much of it was in a code that Jake couldn't decipher. One entry, however, had been crystal clear. "They think they can bury the truth, but some secrets have a way of surfacing. If something happens to me, Jake will need to know. The barn holds everything." Now, standing before the massive structure, Jake felt the weight of that responsibility. The barn loomed against the brightening sky, its weathered wood and corrugated metal roof giving no hint of the secrets within. He'd circled the building twice, noting there were no windows on the ground level and only one main entrance, secured with a heavy padlock that looked far too new for a supposedly abandoned farming operation. The lock picked easier than expected, a skill learned during his rebellious teenage years in the mountains. The massive doors swung open with a groan that echoed across the empty landscape, and Jake stepped into darkness that smelled of motor oil and something else he couldn't identify. His flashlight beams swept across the interior, revealing not the farming equipment he'd expected, but something far more intriguing. The barn had been converted into what appeared to be a sophisticated workshop. Workbenches lined the walls, covered with electronic equipment, computers, and devices he couldn't begin to identify. In the center of the space sat several vehicles under heavy tarps. Jake pulled away the first tarp, revealing a sleek black boat unlike anything he'd ever seen. Its hull was designed for speed, but mounted on the bow was equipment that looked distinctly military in nature. The second tarp covered what appeared to be a modified helicopter, its rotor blades folded back and its body painted in a matte gray that seemed to absorb light. But it was the third discovery that made his blood run cold. Beneath the final tarp sat a submarine, small, clearly designed for covert operations, with modifications that spoke of serious government funding. Jake ran his hands along its hull, feeling the advanced materials and noting the complete absence of any identifying markings. A sound from outside froze him in place. The distant hum of an approaching boat engine carried across the water, growing steadily louder. Jake killed his flashlight and moved to the barn door, peering through the gap between the massive panels. A sleek speedboat was cutting through the morning mist, heading directly for the island's small dock. 3 figures in dark clothing were visible on deck, and even at this distance, Jake could see they moved with the purposeful efficiency of professionals. His grandfather's warning echoed in his mind. Trust no one who comes asking questions about the island. Jake quickly replaced the tarps and slipped out of the barn, making sure to secure the padlock behind him. He needed to get back to the cabin and figure out his next move, but the approaching visitors would reach the dock before he could make it across the open ground without being seen. Instead, he circled around to the back of the barn and found what he was looking for, a maintenance ladder leading to the roof. The climb was treacherous, the old metal rungs protesting under his weight, but within minutes he was lying flat against the corrugated surface, watching as the boat tied up at the dock. The 3 visitors moved with military precision, one remaining with the boat, while the other 2 headed toward the cabin. They wore expensive-looking outdoor gear, but Jake caught the telltale bulge of concealed weapons beneath their jackets. These weren't tourists or government officials making a social call. From his elevated position, Jake watched them search the cabin with practiced efficiency. They weren't looking for him. They were looking for something specific. When they emerged 20 minutes later, their body language suggested they hadn't found what they were seeking. One of them pulled out a satellite phone and made a brief call. Jake couldn't hear the words, but the tone was clearly one of frustration. Then, to his growing alarm, they began walking directly toward the barn. Jake pressed himself flatter against the roof, trying to become invisible against the metal surface. His mind raced through possibilities. Who were these people? What were they looking for? And most importantly, what would they do if they discovered him here? The sound of the barn's padlock being cut sent a chill down his spine. The ferry's engine coughed to life just as the first drops of rain began to fall. Jake pulled his jacket tighter and watched the mainland shrink into grey mist behind them. Captain Morrison, a weathered man who looked like he'd been sailing these waters since before Jake was born, barely glanced up from his controls. "Haven't seen you before," Morrison called over the engine noise. "You the Hartwell boy?" "Jake Hartwell. I inherited my grandfather's place on Raven's Cove." Morrison's hands stilled on the wheel for just a moment. "That so?" Old Thomas was a good man. Kept to himself mostly, but good. His eyes found Jake's in the reflection of the wheelhouse window. "Island's been quiet since he passed. Real quiet." Something in the captain's tone made Jake's stomach tighten. "What do you mean by that?" "Nothing much. Just used to see lights over there some nights, equipment moving around. Normal farm business, I figured." Morrison adjusted their heading as the wind picked up. "But lately, nothing. Like the place just went dead." The 40-minute crossing gave Jake too much time to think. The manila envelope from his grandfather's lawyer sat heavy in his backpack, containing keys, property deeds, and a handwritten note that simply read, "The barn holds our family's legacy. Trust no one until you understand what's at stake." Teach. As Raven's Cove emerged from the rain and mist, Jake felt his breath catch. The island was larger than he'd expected, maybe 2 square miles of rocky coastline, giving way to rolling fields and dense woods. A weathered dock extended into the deeper water, and beyond it, a gravel road wound up toward a cluster of buildings nestled against the tree line. "Dock's still solid," Morrison said, expertly maneuvering the ferry alongside the pilings. "Your grandfather kept everything in good repair. I'll be back this way Tuesday if you need a ride to the mainland." Jake shouldered his pack and stepped onto the dock, testing the planks beneath his feet. They felt sturdy enough, though moss had begun claiming the edges. "Thanks, Captain. I might take you up on that." "Word of advice, son," Morrison said as he prepared to cast off. "Whatever your grandfather was up to out here, there's folks who took real interest in it. Might be smart to keep a low profile until you figure things out." Before Jake could ask what he meant, the ferry was already pulling away, leaving him alone on the dock with the sound of rain pattering against his jacket hood. The walk up to the main house took 10 minutes through increasingly heavy rain. Jake passed what looked like a generator shed and a small greenhouse before the 2-story farmhouse came into view. It was simple but well-maintained, with a wraparound porch and fresh paint that couldn't have been more than a year old. But it was the barn that made him stop walking altogether. The structure was massive, easily 3 times the size of the house, with a gambrel roof that rose at least 40 feet into the grey sky. What struck him as odd were the windows, or rather, the lack of them. Most barns had windows for natural light, but this one was built like a fortress, with solid walls broken only by the main doors and what looked like ventilation slats near the roofline. Jake found the house key where the lawyer had said it would be, under a loose stone by the back steps. Inside, the farmhouse felt frozen in time. His grandfather's coffee cup still sat by the kitchen sink, and newspapers dated just weeks before his death lay folded on the dining table. Everything was clean, but carried the hollow feeling of a place where life had simply stopped. He dropped his pack and moved to the front window that offered the best view of the barn. Even from here, he could see heavy-duty electrical lines running from the generator shed to the structure. That seemed like serious overkill for storing farm equipment. The rain was coming down harder now, drumming against the roof with increasing intensity. Jake decided to explore the house first and wait for better weather before investigating the barn. But as he climbed the stairs to check out the bedrooms, a sound from outside made him freeze. It was the distant rumble of a boat engine, different from Captain Morrison's ferry, deeper, more powerful. Jake moved to the upstairs window and peered through the rain toward the dock. A sleek cabin cruiser was approaching the island, moving fast despite the rough water. As it drew closer, he could make out at least 3 figures on board, all wearing dark rain gear. His grandfather's words echoed in his mind. "Trust no one until you understand what's at stake." Jake grabbed his pack and headed for the back door. Whatever was in that barn, whoever these people were, he had a feeling his quiet inheritance had just become something much more dangerous. The rain would provide cover, but not for long. The metallic taste of fear coated Jake's mouth as he crouched behind the generator, watching the dark figures move through his grandfather's barn like predators stalking prey. 3 men in tactical gear swept the space with military precision, their red laser sights cutting through the darkness like angry fireflies. "Nothing here but old farm equipment," one whispered into his radio. "Moving to Sector 2. Jake held his breath, pressing himself deeper into the shadows. The weight of the documents he'd found earlier seemed to burn against his chest, where he'd tucked them inside his jacket. Whatever his grandfather had been involved in, these men were willing to break into private property to find it. The lead operative paused near the John Deere tractor, tilting his head as if listening. Jake's heart hammered so loud he was certain they'd hear it. After what felt like an eternity, the man moved on, following his team toward the back of the barn. This was his chance. Jake slipped from his hiding spot and crept toward the main entrance, keeping low and moving between the farm equipment. The massive sliding door stood partially open, revealing a sliver of moonlit yard beyond. Freedom was 20 feet away. A floorboard creaked under his weight. "Contact!" someone hissed behind him. Jake bolted for the door as shouts erupted throughout the barn. He burst into the night air and sprinted across the yard, his boots slipping on wet grass. Behind him, powerful flashlight beams swept the darkness, hunting for him. The forest loomed ahead, a wall of black pines that had sheltered him countless times during childhood games of hide-and-seek. But this wasn't a game anymore. The crack of a rifle split the night, and bark exploded from a tree inches from his head. Jake dove into the underbrush, thorns tearing at his clothes as he scrambled deeper into the woods. His lungs burned as he climbed the steep terrain, using skills his grandfather had taught him during their hunting trips. Stay low, move quietly, use the landscape to your advantage. More shots echoed behind him, but they were firing blind now. The island's dense forest was his domain, not theirs. He'd grown up here, knew every game trail and hidden ravine, but he also knew the island was only so big, and if they had a boat waiting offshore, he was trapped. Jake paused behind a massive oak to catch his breath and listen. Voices drifted up from below, spread out in a search pattern. Professional, organized. These weren't random thieves, they were military or intelligence operatives. He pulled out his phone, praying for signal bars. Nothing. The island's remote location that had once seemed charming now felt like a death sentence. He was completely cut off, with armed men hunting him through the darkness. A branch snapped to his left, too close. Jake moved again, climbing higher up the rocky slope toward the island's center. His grandfather had shown him caves up here, places where bootleggers had once hidden their operations during Prohibition. If he could reach them, he might have a chance to hide until dawn. Thermal imaging shows movement, northwest quadrant, a voice called out below him. Jake's blood chilled. They had night vision equipment, possibly thermal scopes. His childhood knowledge of the terrain meant nothing against military-grade technology. He needed a new plan, fast. The old quarry. Jake remembered the flooded limestone pit on the island's far side, where cold water would mask his heat signature. It was dangerous. The water was deep and ice-cold even in summer, but it might be his only chance. He changed direction, angling through the trees toward the northern shore. The voices behind him grew more distant, but he knew they'd regroup and continue the hunt. Whatever those documents contained, someone was willing to commit murder to protect the secret. As he moved through the forest, fragments of what he'd read earlier pieced themselves together in his mind. Project Lighthouse, biological weapons research, his grandfather's signature on transfer orders. None of it made sense with the gentle man who taught him to fish and whittle wood carvings. The sound of rushing water reached his ears. Jake emerged from the tree line to see moonlight reflecting off the quarry's surface 50 feet below. The limestone walls were steep but climbable, with enough handholds to make his way down. Behind him, flashlight beams swept through the forest, getting closer. Jake took a deep breath and began his descent, fingers finding familiar cracks in the rock face. The water below looked black and uninviting, but it represented survival. As his boots touched the quarry's edge, he heard shouts from above. They'd found his trail. He slipped into the frigid water without a splash, gasping as the cold shocked his system. The quarry was fed by underground springs, maintaining a temperature that would confuse thermal imaging. Jake swam to an underwater ledge he remembered from teenage dares and surfaced just enough to breathe, keeping most of his body submerged. Lights appeared at the quarry's rim, scanning the water's surface. Jake held perfectly still, fighting the cold that threatened to make him shiver and create ripples. One wrong move now, and his grandfather's secrets would die with him. The ferry's diesel engine coughed to life as Jake climbed aboard, his backpack heavy with the evidence he'd gathered from the barn. The captain, a weathered man named Murphy, barely glanced up from his navigation charts as they pulled away from the dock. Jake had told him he needed supplies from the mainland, a believable enough story for someone living alone on Grandfather's Island. As the island shrunk behind them, Jake felt the weight of what he'd discovered pressing down on his shoulders. The photographs, the documents, the sophisticated equipment hidden beneath decades of dust and farming tools. It all pointed to something far bigger than he could have imagined. His grandfather hadn't been the simple farmer everyone believed him to be. The 20-minute crossing gave Jake time to think, but his thoughts kept circling back to the same questions. Who were the people in those photographs? What was the real purpose of that underground facility? And most importantly, who else knew about it? Murphy's voice cut through his reverie. Storms coming in from the northeast. Might be the last crossing for a day or two. Jake looked up at the darkening sky, surprised to see how quickly the weather had changed. How long do I have on the mainland? If you want to get back today, maybe 2 hours. After that, you're stuck until she blows over. 2 hours wasn't much time, but it would have to do. Jake had a specific destination in mind, the Millbrook Public Library. If his grandfather had been involved in something significant, there might be records, newspaper articles, or historical documents that could provide answers. The ferry docked with a shudder, and Jake hurried down the gangplank. Millbrook was a small coastal town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. The library sat on Main Street, a brick building that had seen better days but still maintained a dignified presence among the newer shops and restaurants. Inside, the librarian, Mrs. Henderson, greeted him with a warm smile. She'd known his grandfather, had probably known his father too. Jake realized he needed to be careful about what he asked for. "I'm doing some research on the island's history," he told her. "Family project, you know. Wondering if you have any old newspapers or records from the 1940s and 50s. Mrs. Henderson's eyes lit up. "Oh, how wonderful! Your grandfather was such an interesting man, always very private but interesting. The microfilm archives are in the back room. Would you like me to show you how the machine works?" Jake spent the next hour scrolling through decades of local news, looking for any mention of his grandfather or the island. Most of what he found was routine: weather reports, fishing updates, the occasional mention of island residents in social columns. But then, buried in a 1953 edition of the Millbrook Herald, he found something that made his blood run cold. The headline read, "Federal Investigation Continues into Missing Research Facility." The article was brief, mentioning only that federal agents were looking into the disappearance of sensitive materials from an unnamed government installation. What caught Jake's attention was a single line near the end. "Authorities are particularly interested in questioning persons with access to boats and knowledge of local waters." He printed the article and continued searching, but found nothing else directly relevant. However, the absence of information was almost as telling as its presence. For a small-town newspaper that usually covered every church bake sale and high school football game in detail, the lack of coverage about anything involving the island or his grandfather seemed deliberate. Jake's phone buzzed with a text message from an unknown number. "Stop looking, or you'll end up like your grandfather." His hands trembled as he read the message again. Someone was watching him. Someone knew exactly what he was doing and where he was. Jake looked around the library, but saw only Mrs. Henderson shelving books and an elderly man reading a magazine. He quickly gathered his things and headed for the door, but Mrs. Henderson called out to him. "Find what you were looking for, dear?" "Some of it," Jake replied, trying to keep his voice steady. "Mrs. Henderson, do you remember anything unusual about my grandfather? Anything that seemed different about him?" The older woman paused in her shelving, considering the question carefully. He was always very well informed about current events, even living alone on that island. Sometimes he'd mention things that hadn't even made it into our local paper yet. And he had visitors occasionally, men in suits who didn't look like they belonged in these parts. She lowered her voice. "Between you and me, I always suspected your grandfather had a more interesting past than he let on." Jake thanked her and hurried outside, checking over his shoulder as he walked toward the dock. The storm clouds were gathering more quickly now, and he could smell rain in the air. Murphy was already preparing to cast off when Jake reached the ferry. "Cutting it close," the captain said. "Hope your business was worth it." As they pulled away from shore, Jake wondered if anything could be worth the danger he was apparently in. Jake's hands trembled as he stared at the photograph, the faces of 3 men in military fatigues burning into his memory. One face he recognized immediately. His grandfather, decades younger but unmistakably Samuel Morrison. The other 2 were strangers, but their eyes held the same hardened look of men who'd seen too much. The wooden crate sat open before him like Pandora's box, its contents scattered across the barn floor. Documents in multiple languages, maps marked with coordinates, and photographs that seemed to tell a story he wasn't sure he wanted to understand. The metallic taste of fear coated his tongue as he reached for another folder. A vehicle's engine rumbled in the distance. Jake's blood turned to ice. He'd been so absorbed in the discovery that he'd lost track of time and forgotten to watch for approaching boats. The sound grew louder, definitely heading toward the island. He scrambled to gather the documents, shoving them back into the crate with shaking hands. The engine cut off near the dock. Moving faster than he thought possible, Jake dragged the crate toward the back corner of the barn where he'd found it. His grandfather had hidden it well, beneath loose floorboards covered by decades of hay and dust. As footsteps approached on the gravel path outside, Jake lowered the crate into its hiding place and kicked hay over the disturbed floorboards. "Told you he was here," a man's voice carried through the barn walls. "Boats tied up at the dock." "Should have taken care of this problem before the old man died," another voice replied, rougher than the first. "Now we've got complications." Jake pressed himself against the barn's back wall, his heart hammering so loud he was certain they'd hear it. Through a gap in the weathered boards, he could see 2 figures approaching, the same men from the marina. The tall one wore expensive clothes that looked out of place on the island, while his companion moved with the fluid grace of someone accustomed to violence. "Jake Morrison?" the well-dressed man called out. "We know you're here. We just want to talk." Jake held his breath, fighting every instinct that screamed at him to run. There was nowhere to go. The island was small, and they controlled the only way off. "We're not going to hurt you," the man continued, his voice carrying the false warmth of a used car salesman. "We simply need to discuss your grandfather's property. There are certain arrangements that need to be honored." The barn door creaked open, and Jake could hear their footsteps on the wooden floor. He crept along the back wall, moving toward a small window he'd noticed earlier. If he could slip out quietly, maybe he could circle around to his boat. "Interesting," the rougher voice said. "Someone's been digging around in here recently. Look at these scuff marks in the dust." Jake's stomach dropped. In his panic, he'd left obvious signs of his presence. The floorboards he'd disturbed probably looked like a neon sign to anyone paying attention. "Mr. Morrison?" the well-dressed man called again, and Jake could hear him moving deeper into the barn. "Your grandfather was involved in certain activities that created obligations. Those obligations don't die with him. They transfer to his heir. That would be you." Through the gap in the boards, Jake watched the violent-looking man examine the area where he'd found the crate. The man knelt down, brushing away hay with practiced efficiency. It would only be moments before he found the loose floorboards. "Here," the man said quietly. He found it. Jake's time had run out. As quietly as possible, he eased the small window open and squeezed through, dropping to the ground outside. The window was on the barn's blind side, but he'd have to cross open ground to reach the tree line. "The hiding spot's been accessed recently," he heard through the barn walls. "Whatever was in here, he's seen it." "Then our timeline just accelerated," the well-dressed man replied. "Find him. This can't leave the island." Jake sprinted toward the trees, abandoning any pretense of stealth. Behind him, he heard shouts and the sound of men bursting out of the barn. His boat was moored on the far side of the island from where they'd landed. If he could reach it without being seen, he might have a chance. Branches whipped at his face as he crashed through the underbrush, his city-soft hands already bleeding from thorns and rough bark. The island that had seemed like a peaceful inheritance now felt like a prison, every shadow potentially hiding danger. A gunshot cracked through the air, the bullet splintering bark inches from his head. "Last warning, Morrison!" the rough voice shouted. "Stop running and we'll make this quick!" Jake dove behind a fallen log as another shot rang out. His grandfather's secret had already cost one life. He wasn't about to let it cost his own. But trapped on the island with armed men hunting him, his options were disappearing as fast as the daylight filtering through the canopy above. The speedboat's engine grew louder, cutting through the morning mist like a blade. Jake pressed himself against the cold stone of the lighthouse, his heart hammering against his ribs. Through the narrow window, he watched three figures in dark clothing leap onto his grandfather's dock with practiced efficiency. He'd made it to the lighthouse, just as dawn broke, the metal briefcase clutched in his sweating palm. The documents inside had revealed more than he'd bargained for, shipping manifests, payment records, and photographs that painted a picture of an operation spanning decades. His grandfather hadn't just been hiding equipment in that barn, he'd been documenting something that reached into the highest levels of government and industry. The lead figure on the dock pointed toward the farmhouse, then made sharp gestures to his companions. Even from this distance, Jake could see they moved like soldiers. These weren't the same bumbling thugs from yesterday. Someone had sent professionals. Jake's phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "We have your friend Sarah. Lighthouse. 1 hour. Come alone." His blood turned to ice. Sarah wasn't supposed to be involved in this. She'd only driven him to the ferry yesterday morning, laughing about his mysterious inheritance and making him promise to call when he figured out what the old man had left him. Now she was paying for his curiosity. The lighthouse creaked around him as wind picked up off the water. Jake climbed the spiral stairs to the lamp room, hoping for a better view. Through the salt-stained glass, he could see the men splitting up. One headed for the farmhouse, while the other two moved toward the barn. They knew exactly where to look. Jake opened the briefcase again, spreading the documents across the dusty floor. The shipping records showed regular deliveries to the island over 30 years, always on moonless nights. The payments came from shell companies, but his grandfather had meticulously traced them back to their sources: defense contractors, pharmaceutical companies, and government agencies that officially didn't exist. But it was the photographs that made his stomach churn. Barrels being unloaded under cover of darkness, men in hazmat suits, and in one particularly clear shot, a familiar face. Senator Morrison, the man currently running for president on a platform of environmental protection. He was shaking hands with Jake's grandfather beside a truck full of containers marked with biohazard symbols. The island hadn't been hiding farming equipment. It had been a dumping ground for toxic waste, hidden in plain sight while Senator Morrison built his political career on promises of a cleaner future. And Jake's grandfather had been both participant and witness, collecting evidence that could destroy the most powerful man in the country. A shout from below broke his concentration. Through the window, he saw one of the men emerging from the barn, speaking rapidly into a radio. They'd discovered the hidden chamber, but from their body language they hadn't found what they were looking for. The briefcase had been their real target all along. Jake's phone rang. This time he answered. "Mr. Reynolds." The voice was smooth, educated, carrying the confidence of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "I believe you have something that belongs to us." "I don't know what you're talking about. Please don't insult my intelligence. Your grandfather was a meticulous man. We've been searching for his insurance policy for quite some time. Now, thanks to your arrival, we know it exists." Jake watched the men regrouping at the dock. "What happened to my grandfather?" A pause. "Charles died peacefully in his sleep. Natural causes, I assure you. He was old, tired, and the weight of his secrets had become burdensome. But you, Mr. Reynolds, are young and healthy. It would be unfortunate if something were to happen to you over a matter that predates your birth." And Sarah? Safe for now. Bring us the documents, and she remains that way. You have 30 minutes. The line went dead. Jake stared at the phone, then at the evidence scattered around him. 30 years of systematic poisoning covered up by the very people claiming to protect the environment. His grandfather had been trapped in the middle, probably blackmailed into silence, collecting proof as his only insurance against permanent silence. But now Jake held that proof, and Sarah's life hung in the balance. He gathered the documents, his mind racing through possibilities. The mainland was 20 miles away, too far to swim, and they controlled the only boats. The lighthouse had no weapons, no radio, nothing but crumbling stone and rusted metal. Then his eyes fell on the lamp assembly above him. The lighthouse had been automated decades ago, but the old manual controls were still there, including the emergency beacon that could be seen for miles. The Coast Guard would have to investigate any distress signal, and with federal witnesses present, these men couldn't simply make everyone disappear. Jake began climbing toward the lamp, clutching the briefcase. Time was running out, but he wasn't going down without a fight. The sound of approaching boats cut through the morning stillness like a knife. Jake's blood turned to ice as he peered through the barn's weathered slats, counting at least 3 vessels closing in on the island's eastern shore. These weren't the Coast Guard or local fishermen. The sleek black speedboats moved with military precision, their occupants dressed in tactical gear. "They found us," Maya whispered, her face pale as she crouched beside him. "How did they track us so fast?" Jake's mind raced. The satellite phone. It had to be. Even encrypted communications could be traced with the right equipment, and these people clearly had resources. He cursed himself for being so careless, but there was no time for regret now. "We need to move," he said, grabbing the backpack they'd prepared with the most crucial documents. "The tunnel. It's our only way out." They'd spent the previous evening exploring the underground passage Maya had discovered. It stretched from beneath the barn's foundation, running nearly 200 yards through the island's rocky core before emerging in a concealed cave on the western shore. Jake's grandfather had been thorough in his preparations, anticipating this exact scenario. As they descended into the hidden chamber, Jake could hear boots hitting the dock above. Voices carried through the floorboards, calm, professional, deadly. These weren't the kind of men who left witnesses. "Search everything," a gravelly voice commanded. "He's here somewhere, and so are those files. Remember, we need him alive until we know what he's shared, and with whom." Maya grabbed Jake's arm as they reached the tunnel entrance. "What about the evidence we left behind? All those documents?" "Copies," Jake said, shouldering the backpack. "Everything important is right here, and I uploaded the most damaging files to a secure server last night." He hadn't told her about the dead man's switch he'd programmed. If he didn't check in every 72 hours, the information would automatically go public. It was his grandfather's contingency plan, detailed in the journal's final pages. The tunnel was a marvel of engineering, carved through solid rock with reinforced supports. Battery-powered LED strips provided dim illumination, casting eerie shadows on the walls. Their footsteps echoed, despite their attempts at stealth, but the thick stone would muffle the sound from above. Halfway through the passage, Jake noticed something that made him stop. Fresh scratches on the wall, near a section that looked different from the rest. He ran his fingers along the stone until he found a hidden panel. Behind it was a small cavity containing another package wrapped in oilcloth. "Your grandfather really thought of everything," Maya said, as Jake quickly examined the contents. More photographs, these showing faces he recognized from recent news reports, politicians, CEOs, military contractors, all connected to the network his grandfather had uncovered. A distant explosion shook dust from the tunnel ceiling. They'd found the barn's hidden entrance. "They're destroying evidence," Jake realized. "Everything they can't take with them." They ran now, abandoning stealth for speed. The tunnel seemed to stretch forever, and Jake's lungs burned as they pushed forward. Behind them, he could hear the faint echo of pursuit. Someone had found the passage. The cave exit was concealed behind a curtain of hanging moss and twisted driftwood. Jake pushed through first, scanning the rocky shoreline. His grandfather's old fishing boat was exactly where the journal said it would be, hidden in a natural inlet and covered with camouflage netting. "Can you operate that thing?" Maya asked, eyeing the weathered vessel skeptically. "I've been running boats since I was 12, Jake replied, already pulling away the netting. The engine was old but well-maintained, and it turned over on the second try. "We'll follow the coast south. Stay in the shallows where they can't follow with those speedboats." As they pulled away from the island, Jake looked back to see smoke rising from the barn. Flames licked at the structure his grandfather had built, consuming decades of careful preparation. But the real evidence was safe. The truth his grandfather had died protecting would finally see the light. The pursuit came sooner than expected. One of the black boats had circled the island, and Jake spotted it rounding the southern point just as they reached the mainland's rocky coast. The fishing boat was no match for the speedboat's power, but Jake knew these waters better than any outsider. He guided them into a maze of tide pools and submerged rocks, places where a shallow draft fishing boat could go but a sleek speedboat would run aground. The sound of their pursuer's engine grew distant as Jake navigated by memory and instinct, following channels his grandfather had taught him years ago. They reached the small coastal town of Millfield just as the sun climbed above the horizon. Jake tied off at a weathered pier, his hands shaking with adrenaline. They'd escaped, but this was far from over. The people behind this conspiracy had revealed their hand, which meant Jake was closer to the truth than they could tolerate. Now it was time to take the fight to them. The pre-dawn darkness felt heavier as Jake crept toward the barn, every shadow a potential threat. His grandfather's journal pressed against his chest, the final entry still burning in his mind. "They're coming. The prototype must be destroyed before they find it. Trust no one, T." The barn door stood slightly ajar, exactly as he'd left it 3 hours ago. But something felt wrong. The air carried a metallic scent that hadn't been there before, and the usual chorus of night insects had fallen silent. Jake slipped through the gap, his flashlight cutting through the blackness. The farming equipment sat undisturbed, but he knew better now. Behind the rusted plow, concealed by decades of carefully maintained neglect, lay the entrance to his grandfather's real work. His fingers found the hidden switch, and the floor panels slid away with a pneumatic hiss. The LED strips flickered to life, illuminating the steel staircase that descended into the island's bedrock. Each step echoed despite his careful movements, the sound swallowed by the underground chamber that shouldn't exist. The laboratory spread before him, like something from a fever dream. Banks of computers lined the walls, their screens casting an eerie blue glow across workbenches covered in components he couldn't identify. But at the center of it all sat the reason men had died and would die again. The device was smaller than he'd expected, roughly the size of a briefcase but infinitely more complex. Crystalline structures pulsed with inner light, connected by filaments that seemed to bend space around them. Even dormant, it radiated an energy that made his teeth ache. Magnificent, isn't it? Jake spun, his heart slamming against his ribs. A woman emerged from the shadows near the far wall, her silver hair perfectly styled despite the hour. She wore an expensive suit that looked absurdly out of place in the underground lab. "Dr. Victoria Chen," she said, extending a manicured hand. "I worked with your grandfather for 15 years before he developed a conscience." Jake kept his distance, his mind racing. "You're supposed to be dead. The records said—" "The records say what we need them to say." Her smile was arctic. "Richard was always sentimental about you, showed me pictures from your visits. Such a bright boy," he said. "I wonder if he'd be proud of how far you've come. Far enough to know what that thing does." Jake nodded toward the device. Far enough to know why you killed him. Chen's expression didn't change. Your grandfather killed himself, Jake. Guilt has a way of eating brilliant minds from the inside. 30 years of black-budget research, of pushing the boundaries of physics itself. And in the end, he couldn't handle the implications. She moved closer, her heels clicking against the polished floor. Do you know what unlimited energy means? Not just clean power or an end to fossil fuels. We're talking about reshaping civilization itself. Whoever controls this technology controls the future. And you think that should be you. I think it should be someone who understands the bigger picture. Chen gestured at the laboratory around them. Richard hid down here like a hermit, terrified of his own genius. But the world is changing, Jake. China is building fusion reactors while we argue about windmills. This device could ensure American dominance for the next century. Jake's hand drifted toward the emergency shutdown his grandfather had shown him in the journal's diagrams. One switch, and the fusion reaction would cascade into nothing. The prototype would be slag, and with it, 30 years of research. I wouldn't, if I were you. Chen's voice carried a new edge. My associates have been watching the island for weeks. They know about the girl. Sarah, isn't it? Such a pretty thing. It would be unfortunate if something happened to her because of your misguided heroism. The threat hit him like a physical blow. Sarah had helped him decode the journal, had stood by him when the Coast Guard dismisses his story about the men who'd come for the barn. Now she was in danger because of secrets she'd never asked to learn. What do you want? Cooperation. Your grandfather programmed biometric locks that only family DNA can override. We need you alive and willing, at least until we've extracted everything from his systems. Jake forced himself to remain calm, though rage burned in his chest. And after that? After that, you'll have served your purpose. Chen pulled a satellite phone from her jacket. Make the call, Jake. Tell your friend to come to the island. Tell her you've found something incredible. My people will handle the rest. The device pulsed brighter, as if responding to the tension in the room. Jake stared at it, understanding finally why his grandfather had chosen isolation over innovation. Some discoveries were too dangerous for the world as it was. But looking at Chen's cold smile, he realized the world might not have a choice. The phone felt impossibly heavy as she placed it in his palm. The speedboat's engine roared to life behind them as Jake pushed their stolen vessel to its limits, salt spray stinging his face in the pre-dawn darkness. Sarah crouched beside him, clutching the waterproof bag containing the photographs and documents they'd recovered from the barn's hidden chamber. "They're gaining on us!" she shouted over the wind and engine noise. Jake glanced back at the pursuing boat's spotlight, cutting through the gloom. The larger vessel had more horsepower, but Jake knew these waters like the back of his hand. His grandfather had taught him every reef, every current, every hidden passage among the outer islands. "Hold on!" he yelled, yanking the wheel hard to starboard. Their boat lurched sickeningly as Jake threaded them between two jagged rock formations that barely showed above the waterline. The spotlight behind them swept frantically as their pursuers were forced to slow, unwilling to risk the treacherous passage in the dark. Sarah pulled out her phone, checking for signal bars. Still nothing. How far to the mainland? Too far with them on our tail. Jake's mind raced through options. The photographs they'd found showed government officials shaking hands with known arms dealers, cargo manifests for weapons shipments, and bank records linking Senator Morrison to offshore accounts. It was enough to bring down half of Washington, but only if they lived long enough to get it to the right people. A sharp crack echoed across the water, followed by a splash 20 yards to their left. "Are they shooting at us?" Sarah's voice pitched higher. "Warning shots," Jake muttered, though he wasn't entirely sure. These people had already killed his grandfather and burned down the barn to hide the evidence. They wouldn't hesitate to eliminate 2 more witnesses. The coastline of Pine Ridge Island loomed ahead, its rocky shores barely visible in the darkness. Jake had spent countless summers exploring its caves and hidden coves with his grandfather. If he could reach the eastern inlet before their pursuers cleared the reef passage. "There!" Sarah pointed ahead. "Is that another boat?" Jake's heart sank as he spotted the running lights of a second vessel emerging from behind Pine Ridge Island. They'd been herded into a trap, cut off from their escape route to the mainland. "New plan," he said, cutting the engine and letting their momentum carry them toward a narrow channel between 2 towering rock walls. "We're going to ground." "What? Jake, that's suicide." "Trust me." He guided them into the shallow water, feeling the hull scrape against submerged rocks. At the last second, he killed the engine completely and grabbed Sarah's hand. "Now we swim." They plunged into the frigid water, just as their boat wedged itself firmly between 2 boulders. Jake led Sarah toward a dark opening in the cliff face that was invisible from the water, unless you knew exactly where to look. Behind them, the pursuit boat's engines echoed off the rock walls as they searched for their quarry. Powerful lights swept back and forth, illuminating the abandoned vessel. Jake and Sarah hauled themselves onto a narrow ledge inside the sea cave, both shivering and gasping. The cave extended deep into the island, a natural tunnel that his grandfather had shown him years ago. "The bag," Sarah whispered urgently. "Is it waterproof enough?" Jake checked the seal. "Should be." He hoped the documents inside had survived their impromptu swim. Without that evidence, they had nothing but their word against some of the most powerful people in the country. Voices carried across the water from outside the cave. Their pursuers had found the abandoned boat and were discussing their next move. Jake caught fragments of conversation that chilled him to the bone. "Can't have gotten far. Morrison wants this contained." "No witnesses." Sarah grabbed his arm. "They're going to search the caves." Jake nodded grimly. The tunnel they were in connected to an old mining shaft that emerged near the island's abandoned lighthouse. It would be a treacherous climb in the dark, but it was their only option. "Follow me," he whispered. "And whatever you do, don't let go of that bag." They began crawling deeper into the cave system, guided only by Jake's memory and the faint echo of their pursuers' voices behind them. The tunnel narrowed as they climbed, forcing them to squeeze through gaps barely wide enough for their bodies. 20 minutes later, they emerged from a concealed opening behind a tangle of dead brush near the lighthouse ruins. The eastern horizon showed the first pale hint of dawn, and Jake could see the lights of their pursuers still searching the shoreline below. Sarah pulled out her phone again. One bar flickered weakly on the screen. "I might be able to get a message out," she said. "To who?" "We don't know how deep this conspiracy goes." She met his eyes in the growing light. "I know someone. A journalist who's been investigating Senator Morrison for months. If we can get this evidence to her." A shout from below cut her off. Someone had spotted the opening to the cave system. They were running out of time. The speedboat's engine roared to life as Jake gunned it toward the mainland. Sarah crouched beside him with the waterproof case clutched against her chest. Behind them, the island grew smaller, but Jake could still see the orange glow flickering through the trees where the barn had stood. The smoke would be visible for miles. "They'll know we escaped!" Sarah shouted over the wind and spray. Jake nodded grimly, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. The documents in that case were their only leverage now, the only thing standing between them and a shallow grave. He'd memorized enough of the contents to know they held evidence of a conspiracy that reached into the highest levels of government, a weapons program that violated every international treaty, funded by black budget money and hidden on his grandfather's island for decades. The GPS showed they were still 20 minutes from shore when Jake spotted the lights behind them. 2 boats, running fast and closing the distance. His grandfather's old speedboat was reliable, but it wasn't built for racing. "Company!" he called out, pointing backward. Sarah turned, and her face went pale in the moonlight. "Can we outrun them?" Jake pushed the throttle to its limit, feeling the boat lift higher out of the water. The engine screamed in protest, but held. "We're about to find out." The pursuing boats split apart, trying to flank them. Jake could see muzzle flashes from the boat on his left, and bullets whined overhead. He yanked the wheel hard right, then left, weaving an erratic pattern that made them a harder target, but also slowed their progress toward shore. "There," Sarah pointed ahead, "the marina lights." Jake could see the cluster of white and red lights marking the Millfield Marina, still 15 minutes away at their current zigzag pace. The boats behind them were gaining ground, and he could hear the deeper roar of their more powerful engines. A spotlight blazed to life from the boat on their right, pinning them in its glare. Jake immediately cut left, but that brought them closer to the other pursuer. More gunfire erupted, and this time he heard bullets smack into the fiberglass hull behind him. "Jake!" Sarah's voice was tight with fear. "I know." He was running out of options. The shore was still too far, and their pursuers would overtake them long before they reached the marina. Unless... Jake suddenly remembered something his grandfather had told him years ago, during one of their fishing trips. There was a channel between two small islands, too shallow for most boats but deep enough for someone who knew exactly where to go. It was a dangerous gamble in the dark, but it might be their only chance. He swung the boat toward a pair of dark shapes that barely showed above the waterline. Sarah looked at him like he'd lost his mind. "Trust me," he said. The channel entrance was invisible in the darkness, marked only by the way the waves broke differently over the hidden rocks. Jake slowed slightly, relying on memory and instinct to find the narrow passage. Too far left and they'd hit the rocks. Too far right and they'd run aground on the sandbar. Behind them, their pursuers had closed to within 100 yards. The spotlight swept back and forth, and Jake could hear shouting voices over the engine noise. They'd be in rifle range in seconds. Jake held his breath and aimed for what looked like solid darkness between the two islands. At the last second, he saw the gap, a slot of deeper water barely wider than their boat. He spun the wheel and felt the hull scrape against something hard as they shot through the passage. The first pursuing boat tried to follow and immediately ran aground with a grinding crash. Jake heard cursing and shouting as its engine died. The second boat swung wide, trying to find another way around the islands, but that would cost them precious minutes. "How did you know about that?" Sarah gasped. "Grandpa Tom," Jake said simply. "He taught me every hidden corner of these waters." They emerged into open water, with a clear run to the marina. Jake could see people on the docks, drawn by the sound of gunfire and high-speed engines. Some were pointing cell phones in their direction, recording everything. The second pursuit boat finally cleared the islands, but it was too late. Jake brought their speedboat sliding into the marina with a crowd of witnesses watching. He grabbed Sarah's hand and the case, and they jumped onto the dock as people surrounded them with questions. "Call the police," Jake shouted, "and the FBI. Tell them Jake Morrison has evidence of federal crimes." In the distance, the second boat had stopped, its crew apparently deciding that a public marina full of witnesses was too risky for a confrontation. Jake watched it turn and disappear back into the darkness. Sarah sagged against him, still clutching the waterproof case. "Is it over?" Jake looked at the crowds, the camera phones, the approaching sirens. "No," he said quietly. "Now the real fight begins." The coordinates led them to a narrow inlet on the island's eastern shore, where jagged rocks formed a natural barrier against the churning Atlantic. Jake killed the boat's engine 50 yards out, letting the current carry them closer, while Marcus scanned the water with binoculars. There, Marcus pointed to what looked like empty ocean. "See how the waves break differently? Something's down there." Jake dropped anchor and checked his diving gear one final time. The water was deep here, maybe 60 feet, and the afternoon sun wouldn't penetrate far enough to illuminate whatever lay beneath. He'd brought underwater lights, but they'd also make him visible to anyone watching from shore. "You sure about this?" Sarah's voice carried over the radio from her position on the mainland. She'd driven to the nearest point with cell service, ready to call for help if they didn't check in every 30 minutes. "No choice," Jake replied, adjusting his mask. "If Crawford's people find this before we do, any evidence goes to the bottom permanently." The water was shockingly cold despite his wetsuit. Jake descended slowly, equalizing pressure as the surface light faded to an eerie blue-green glow. At 40 feet, his light beam caught the outline of something massive and angular, definitely man-made. As he swam closer, the shape resolved into the hull of a cargo ship, listing heavily to starboard. The vessel was smaller than he'd expected, maybe 150 feet long, but it had settled into the rocky bottom like it belonged there. Painted numbers on the hull were still partially visible, a Meridian Expresser. Jake swam toward the stern, looking for the cargo holds Marcus had mentioned. The ship's rear section had taken heavy damage, not from the sinking but from something else. Holes had been deliberately cut into the hull, large enough for a man to swim through. Inside the first hold, his light revealed rows of waterproof containers, still sealed and secured to the bulkheads. Jake approached the nearest one and found stenciled markings that made his blood run cold, a property of U.S. Army, classified materials. He forced himself to move methodically, photographing everything with the underwater camera Marcus had provided. Container after container bore similar markings, along with dates from the 1960s and 70s. Some had additional labels: E. Biological Researcher, A. Restricted Accessor, I. Disposal Authorizer. In the second hold, Jake discovered something that made him pause. Several containers had been opened, their contents long since dispersed into the ocean. But one remained partially sealed, its lid askew. Inside he could see rows of smaller containers, vials or test tubes, most broken or empty. His air gauge showed he was halfway through his supply. Jake forced himself to swim deeper into the ship, following a corridor that led toward what had probably been the crew quarters. Here, the evidence of deliberate sabotage was even clearer. Walls had been blown out, creating easy access for divers to remove specific items. A glint of metal caught his attention. Wedged between two twisted support beams was a briefcase, somehow missed by whoever had stripped the ship. Jake worked it free and found it still latched shut, though the lock had corroded beyond use. As he turned to leave, movement in his peripheral vision made him freeze. Another diver was approaching from the opposite end of the ship, moving with practiced efficiency. Jake killed his light and pressed himself against the bulkhead, hoping the murky water would hide him. The other diver carried professional equipment and moved like someone familiar with the wreck. Jake watched as the figure methodically searched the area he'd just photographed, clearly looking for something specific. When the diver's light swept toward his hiding spot, Jake caught a glimpse of the face behind the mask. It was Hendricks, Crawford's security chief. Jake's mind raced. If Hendricks was here, it meant Crawford knew about their investigation. Worse, it meant they were running out of time. He needed to surface immediately and warn Marcus, but Hendricks was blocking the most direct route to the surface. Moving as quietly as possible, Jake swam deeper into the ship, looking for another way out. The briefcase made him clumsy, but he didn't dare leave it behind. He found a hole in the ship's port side and squeezed through, hoping Hendricks hadn't seen him. As he ascended, Jake watched his depth gauge carefully. Rising too fast would give him decompression sickness, but staying down much longer would use up his remaining air. At 30 feet, he paused for a safety stop and looked down. Hendricks' light was moving systematically through the wreck, but he didn't seem to be following. Jake broke the surface near the boat's stern, keeping his profile low. Marcus immediately pulled him aboard while scanning the water for other divers. "We've got company," Jake gasped, pulling off his mask. "Hendricks is down there." Marcus started the engine while Jake stripped off his gear. "Did you find anything?" Jake held up the briefcase and the waterproof camera. "Enough to bury Crawford, but we need to move fast. They know we're here." The motorboat's engine coughed to life in the pre-dawn darkness, its rumble echoing off the rocky coastline. Jake gripped the wheel with white knuckles, Sarah beside him clutching the waterproof bag containing the evidence they'd risked everything to obtain. Behind them, the island's silhouette grew smaller, but Jake knew their pursuers wouldn't be far behind. There, Sarah pointed toward a cluster of lights on the mainland. "Rockport Harbor. We can reach the FBI field office from there." Jake pushed the throttle forward, and the boat lurched through the choppy waters. The documents in Sarah's bag contained everything: shipping manifests, financial records, and photographs that would expose the smuggling operation his grandfather had stumbled upon. More importantly, they revealed the network of corrupt officials who'd been facilitating the illegal arms trade for decades. The radio crackled to life. "Unknown vessel, this is Coast Guard Cutter Vigilant. Cut your engines and prepare to be boarded." Jake's blood ran cold. Coast Guard doesn't patrol these waters at night unless someone called them, Sarah finished grimly. How deep does this conspiracy go? Behind them, searchlights pierced the darkness. Jake counted at least 3 boats in pursuit, moving fast and closing the distance. He veered sharply to port, using his knowledge of the treacherous shoals that had claimed countless vessels over the years. His grandfather had taught him these waters, every hidden rock and shifting sandbar. "Jake, what are you doing?" Sarah gripped the side rail as the boat bounced violently through the waves. "Trust me." He guided them between 2 jagged outcroppings that barely showed above the waterline. The pursuing boats followed, but their larger size worked against them. Jake heard the grinding screech of metal against stone as one of the Coast Guard cutters scraped bottom. But they couldn't run forever. The fuel gauge showed less than a quarter tank, and the mainland was still 15 minutes away at full throttle. Jake's mind raced through options, each one seeming more desperate than the last. That's when he saw the fog bank rolling in from the northeast. Thick, impenetrable Maine fog that could swallow a boat whole. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "When you can't outrun trouble, sometimes you got to outsmart it." Jake killed the running lights and adjusted course toward the fog wall. Within moments, they were enveloped in a grey cocoon so dense he could barely see the bow of their own boat. He cut the engine to quarter throttle, using compass and instinct to navigate. "They'll have radar," Sarah whispered, as if sound itself might betray their position. "Not if we stay close to the rocks." Jake guided them along the coastline, where the granite cliffs would mask their signature. The fog muffled sound, but he could still hear engines searching, their frustrated pilots unable to pursue at full speed through the dangerous waters. 20 agonizing minutes passed before they emerged from the fog bank. Rockport Harbor spread before them, its fishing fleet bobbing peacefully at anchor. Jake aimed for the public docks, hoping to blend in with the early morning lobstermen preparing for their daily runs. They tied off quickly, Sarah already on her phone trying to reach Agent Morrison, the FBI contact who'd been investigating corruption in the district attorney's office. But the call went straight to voicemail. "We need backup options," Jake said, scanning the harbor for signs of pursuit. "Someone we can trust completely." Sarah's face was pale in the growing dawn light. "I've been thinking about that. What if we can't trust anyone in law enforcement? What if the corruption goes deeper than we imagined?" Before Jake could respond, a familiar figure emerged from the harbormaster's office. Detective Ray Castellanos, the same man who'd questioned Jake after the first attack on the island. The detective's hand rested casually on his service weapon as he approached. "Jake Morrison, you've led us quite a chase." Castellanos smiled, but his eyes remained cold. "Why don't you and the lady come with me? There are some people who'd like to have a conversation." Jake's heart sank. Even Castellanos was compromised. He glanced around desperately, noting the two men in suits flanking the dock's exit. They were trapped, the evidence worthless if it never reached honest hands. "You don't understand," Sarah said, stepping forward with the waterproof bag. "We have proof of everything, the smuggling, the cover-up, all of it." "Oh, I understand perfectly." Castellanos drew his weapon smoothly. "That's exactly why you're coming with me. Can't have loose ends, can we?" Jake's mind raced. They'd come so far, sacrificed so much, only to walk into another trap. But as he looked past Castellanos toward the harbor's entrance, he saw something that made his pulse quicken. A Coast Guard cutter was approaching, but this one flew a different pennant, and Jake recognized the commanding officer from news reports. Captain Elena Vasquez, the whistleblower who'd been investigating corruption within her own ranks. Sometimes salvation came from the most unexpected quarters. The helicopter's rotors cut through the morning air like a mechanical scythe as Jake pressed himself against the rocky outcropping on the island's eastern cliff. Below, armed figures rappelled down ropes with military precision, their black gear stark against the weathered stone. Sarah's hand found his shoulder, her grip tight with fear. "How many?" she whispered. Jake counted quickly. 8 that I can see. Maybe more in the chopper." The aircraft banked sharply, disappearing behind the tree line toward the barn. Jake's stomach clenched as he realized their escape route to the boat was now cut off. The mercenaries would sweep the island systematically, and the hidden cave system they'd discovered yesterday might be their only chance. "The tunnels," he said, pulling Sarah toward the concealed entrance they'd marked with stones. "We need to get underground before they—" A sharp crack echoed across the island as a sniper's bullet splintered the rock inches from Jake's head. He grabbed Sarah's hand and dove for the cave mouth, sliding through the narrow opening just as more shots peppered their former position. The cave plunged into darkness, but Jake had memorized the route during their earlier exploration. His grandfather's journal had mentioned these passages, carved by smugglers generations ago and later used during Prohibition. The old man had connected them to the barn's hidden chamber, creating an escape route that might now save their lives. "Stay close," Jake breathed, feeling his way along the damp stone walls. Behind them, he could hear shouting as the mercenaries discovered the cave entrance. Flashlight beams began probing the darkness, but the tunnel curved sharply, buying them precious time. Sarah stumbled, her breathing harsh in the confined space. "Jake, the data drive—" "Still have it." He patted his jacket pocket, where the encrypted device rested. The proof of Senator Morrison's involvement in the weapons trafficking ring was their only leverage now. Without it, they were just loose ends to be eliminated. The tunnel split ahead, and Jake hesitated. Left led toward the barn and whatever resources they might salvage. Right angled toward the island's northern shore, where treacherous currents had prevented the mercenaries from landing. His grandfather's voice seemed to whisper from memory. Sometimes the dangerous path is the only safe one. He chose left. The passage widened as they approached the barn's sublevel. Jake could hear machinery humming. The mercenaries had activated the hidden elevator. They were systematically searching every chamber, probably under orders to recover any remaining evidence before destroying the facility. A metal grate blocked their path, but Jake remembered his grandfather's lessons about old mechanisms. He found the hidden lever, and the barrier swung open with a soft click. They emerged into the storage room, where wooden crates still held remnants of decades-old smuggling operations. Voices echoed from the main chamber above. Jake recognized the cold tones of the team leader who'd pursued them across 3 states. The man was coordinating a grid search, his confidence absolute. He didn't know about the tunnels yet, but discovery was inevitable. Sarah grabbed Jake's arm, pointing toward a section of wall that looked different from the rest. Together they found another hidden panel, this one concealing a radio setup with modern encryption equipment. his grandfather's final contingency plan. Jake powered up the system, his fingers flying over controls he'd learned during his brief military service. The encrypted channel crackled to life, connecting to a secure government frequency his grandfather had programmed years ago. "This is Jacob Morrison, transmitting from coordinates 46.7 north, 68.2% west," he whispered into the microphone. "I have evidence of federal crimes involving Senator Morrison and international arms trafficking. Requesting immediate federal backup." Static answered him for long seconds. Then a voice responded, "Jake Morrison? This is Agent Patricia Chen, FBI. We've been looking for you. Your grandfather contacted us 6 months ago about suspicious activities. Are you secure?" "Negative. Armed hostiles on site. I have the data drive from the server. Maintain position if possible. Federal response team inbound ETA 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Jake looked at Sarah, seeing his own doubt reflected in her eyes. The mercenaries would find them long before help arrived. A new sound reached them, the whine of power tools cutting through metal. They'd found the elevator shaft and were forcing their way down. Jake made a decision that would have made his grandfather proud. He pulled out the data drive and handed it to Sarah. "Take this through the North Tunnel. Get to the shore and find somewhere to hide until the FBI arrives. What about you? Someone needs to slow them down." He picked up an old mining charge from one of the crates, checking its age-darkened fuse. "These tunnels have been here for 100 years. Maybe it's time they had a little renovation." The cutting sounds grew louder as Jake lit the fuse and Sarah disappeared into the northern passage. He had perhaps 90 seconds before the explosion would seal the underground complex, trapping the mercenaries, but also cutting off his own escape route. His grandfather had always said that some secrets were worth dying for. The fuse burned steadily as Jake ran toward whatever fate awaited him in the darkness ahead. The boat's engine coughed to life just as Jake heard the distant thrum of helicopter rotors cutting through the morning air. His hands shook as he untied the mooring lines, Sarah already scanning the tree line with the rifle raised. "There." She pointed toward the eastern shore where 3 black SUVs had emerged from the forest road, their occupants spilling out like ants from a disturbed hill. Jake gunned the engine, sending the small fishing boat lurching away from the dock. Behind them, the island that had been his sanctuary for barely a week now felt like a death trap. The barn sat silent and empty, its secrets finally exposed, but its danger far from over. "They're setting up something on the beach," Sarah called over the engine noise, squinting through the rifle scope. "Looks like communications equipment." The helicopter grew louder, and Jake spotted it cresting the hills, a sleek black machine that screamed military contractor rather than Coast Guard. His grandfather's boat wasn't built for speed, but it was sturdy and reliable. Jake pushed it as hard as he dared, white foam spraying from the bow as they cut across the choppy water. "The mainland's 20 minutes away," he shouted to Sarah. "We just need to reach the marina and get to that journalist contact of yours." Sarah lowered the rifle, her face grim. "Jake, look at the water ahead." 2 more boats had appeared from behind a small outcropping, faster vessels that were already adjusting course to intercept them. Jake's stomach dropped as he recognized the tactical precision of their movement. These weren't local law enforcement or even federal agents. This was a private army, and they'd planned for every contingency. "Can we outrun them?" Sarah asked, though her tone suggested she already knew the answer. Jake studied the approaching boats, calculating angles and distances. The helicopter was circling wide, probably to avoid any chance of being hit if shooting started. His grandfather's voice echoed in his memory. "Sometimes the only way out is through, boy." "Hold on," Jake said, yanking the wheel hard to starboard. Instead of continuing toward the mainland, he aimed the boat directly at the rocky coastline of a small uninhabited island about half a mile away. Sarah grabbed the rail as the boat pitched and rolled through the turn. "Are you insane?" she yelled. "Those rocks will tear us apart." "My grandfather used to bring me fishing here," Jake called back, his eyes locked on a narrow gap between two towering stone pillars. "There's a passage, but you have to know exactly where to look." The pursuing boats had gained ground during the turn, close enough now that Jake could see armed figures moving on their decks. A sharp crack echoed across the water, and something zinged past his ear. They were shooting. "Get down!" he ordered Sarah, who was already dropping to the deck beside him. The gap in the rocks rushed toward them, looking impossibly narrow from this angle. Jake had been 12 the last time his grandfather brought him through here, teaching him about hidden channels and safe harbors. The old man's lessons had seemed like games then. Now they might be the difference between life and death. Another shot, closer this time, starred the windshield. Jake fought the urge to duck, knowing that even a moment's inattention could send them crashing into the jagged stone walls. The boat's hull scraped against submerged rocks, a grinding sound that made Sarah wince. Then they were through, emerging into a small protected cove that was invisible from the main channel. Jake immediately cut the engine and guided them toward a natural cave opening at the water's edge, another of his grandfather's secret spots. The pursuing boats roared past the hidden entrance, their wakes echoing off the stone walls. In the sudden silence, Jake could hear his own heartbeat hammering in his ears. "That was incredible," Sarah whispered, her face pale but determined. "But they'll figure out where we went eventually." Jake was already moving, pulling emergency supplies from a waterproof compartment. His grandfather had prepared for everything, it seemed. "There's a radio in here. We can call for help while we're hidden." "Jake!" Sarah's voice was strange, and when he looked up, she was staring at something on her phone. "I've been getting text messages. My editor, the FBI contact, even my backup journalist friend. They're all saying the same thing." "What?" "That I'm dead. Killed in a car accident yesterday along with an unnamed companion." She looked up at him with wide eyes. "They're not just trying to silence us. They're erasing us completely." The sound of helicopter rotors grew louder again, echoing off the cave walls. Jake realized with cold certainty that their enemies weren't just powerful, they were thorough, and they weren't planning to leave any loose ends. He reached for the radio, praying that somewhere out there, someone was still listening for the truth. The metallic taste of blood filled Jake's mouth as he pressed himself against the cold stone wall of the underground chamber. Above, footsteps echoed through the barn, at least 3 sets, maybe more. They'd found the island faster than he'd anticipated. Sarah's breathing was shallow beside him, her face pale in the dim light of the emergency lanterns. The documents they'd discovered were clutched against her chest like a shield, though Jake knew paper wouldn't stop bullets. The files contained everything: shipping manifests, payment records, photographs of government officials shaking hands with men whose faces Jake recognized from wanted posters. "We have to get these to the mainland," Sarah whispered, her voice barely audible over the sound of boots overhead. Jake nodded, though his mind raced through their limited options. The boat was moored at the dock, but that's exactly where they'd expect him to go. The emergency radio in the chamber could reach the Coast Guard, but transmission would take time they didn't have. Through the ventilation grate, he could hear muffled voices discussing search patterns. "Check the house first," a gravelly voice commanded. The old man was clever. "If there's a hiding spot, it'll be disguised." Grandfather's voice echoed in Jake's memory from years past. "Every fortress needs a back door, boy. Remember that." At the time, Jake had thought the old man was talking about building chicken coops. Now he understood. Moving carefully to avoid the creaking floorboards above, Jake led Sarah deeper into the chamber. Behind a stack of crates marked with shipping dates from 30 years ago, his fingers found the hidden lever Grandfather had shown him during his last visit. The mechanism was stiff with age, but it gave way with a soft click. A section of the wall swung inward, revealing a narrow tunnel that smelled of salt air and rotting timber. Jake's flashlight beam disappeared into the darkness ahead. "Where does it lead?" Sarah asked. "The old smuggler's cave on the north shore. Grandfather said his father used it during Prohibition." Jake squeezed through the opening first, then helped Sarah with the precious documents. The tunnel was cramped and wet, forcing them to crawl on hands and knees through sections where the ceiling dropped low. Water dripped steadily from somewhere above, and Jake tried not to think about how many decades of storms had weakened these supports. Behind them, the sounds of the search grew fainter, replaced by the increasing roar of waves against rock. The tunnel angled downward now, and Jake could taste salt spray in the air. His flashlight caught the glint of metal ahead, another door, this one reinforced with iron bands. The cave beyond was larger than he'd expected, carved from natural rock formations and widened by human hands long ago. Wooden crates lined the walls, some rotted with age, others surprisingly well preserved. But it was the sight of the small motorboat tied to a natural jetty that made Jake's chest tighten with hope. He planned for this, Jake realized aloud. Grandfather knew this day might come. Sarah was already examining the boat's engine, her investigative instincts taking over despite their desperate situation. "It's been maintained recently. Fuel tank is full." Jake untied the mooring lines while Sarah secured the documents in a waterproof bag she'd found in the boat's storage compartment. The cave opening faced away from the main dock, hidden by an outcropping of rocks that would mask their departure from anyone watching the island's obvious escape routes. As Jake pulled the starter cord, the engine caught on the second try, its low rumble echoing off the cave walls. He'd spent enough summers on these waters to navigate by starlight, and the mainland was only 40 minutes away if they could avoid the patrol boats he was certain were already positioning themselves around the island. Sarah climbed into the boat beside him as he guided them through the narrow cave opening. The night air hit them like a slap, cold and filled with the promise of a storm building on the horizon. Behind them, Grandfather's island sat dark against the sky, though Jake could see flashlight beams sweeping through the barn windows. There, Sarah pointed toward the mainland, where the lights of Port Harbor twinkled like fallen stars. "The Harbor Patrol Station has a secure communication set up. If we can reach them—" Her words were cut off by the deep growl of powerful engines starting up somewhere behind them. Jake didn't need to look back to know they'd been spotted. He pushed the throttle forward, and their small boat leaped across the dark water toward an uncertain safety that seemed impossibly far away. The documents pressed between them contained enough evidence to bring down a conspiracy that had operated in these waters for generations. But first, they had to survive the next 40 minutes. The morning sun cast long shadows across the island as Jake stood at the edge of the cliff, watching the Coast Guard vessels circle the waters below. 3 days had passed since the confrontation in the barn, and the cleanup was finally winding down. Federal agents had been swarming the property, cataloging evidence and dismantling what remained of the operation his grandfather had died protecting. Sarah emerged from the farmhouse, 2 steaming mugs in her hands. She'd insisted on staying to help him navigate the legal maze that followed their discovery. The caffeine was welcome. Sleep had been elusive since learning the truth about everything. "Agent Morrison wants to speak with you again," she said, settling beside him on the weathered bench his grandfather had built decades ago. "Something about the final paperwork." Jake nodded, though his attention remained fixed on the horizon. The weight of his grandfather's letters, now evidence in multiple federal cases, still pressed heavily on his conscience. The old man had spent 40 years carrying the burden of what he'd witnessed, and now Jake understood why he'd seemed so haunted in those final months. "He was trying to protect me," Jake said quietly. "All those years of keeping his distance, making me think he didn't care about family. He knew they were watching." Sarah's hand found his shoulder. He loved you enough to keep you safe, but he also trusted you enough to leave you the truth when the time came. The barn stood empty now, its secret chambers stripped bare. The sophisticated equipment that had monitored shipping lanes and tracked illegal cargo transfers was gone, destined for government labs and courtrooms. What remained was just an old building filled with memories and the ghost of a man who'd sacrificed everything to do what was right. Agent Morrison approached from the farmhouse, his expression more relaxed than it had been during the intense interrogations of the past few days. The federal investigation had uncovered a smuggling network that stretched from the Caribbean to the Canadian border, with Jake's Island serving as a crucial observation post rather than an active participant. "The last of the surveillance equipment has been removed," Morrison said, consulting his tablet. "We've also confirmed that your grandfather's intelligence was instrumental in several major busts over the years. He saved more lives than he probably ever knew." Jake felt a complicated mix of pride and sorrow. His grandfather had been a hero, but a lonely one, unable to share his burden or take credit for his sacrifices. The irony wasn't lost on him that the man who'd taught him to love this island had been forced to use it as a prison for secrets. "What happens now?" Jake asked. "The property is officially clear. No charges, no liens, no federal interest. Your grandfather's work is done, and so is yours." Morrison paused, studying Jake's face. "Though I should mention, we've had some interesting inquiries about your experience and background. If you're ever looking for a career change, the Bureau could use someone with your skills and integrity." Jake almost smiled at that. 3 weeks ago, his biggest concern had been whether to sell the island or try to make a life here. Now federal agents were recruiting him, and he'd somehow become part of a story that would be classified for decades. "I think I'll stick to mountain life," he said. "Less complicated." Morrison shook his hand and headed toward the dock, where the last government boat waited. Within an hour, the island would be truly theirs again, for the first time in 40 years. Sarah stood and stretched, her gaze sweeping across the property. "So what's the plan? Back to North Carolina, or are you thinking of staying?" Jake considered the question he'd been avoiding. The island held painful memories now, but it also represented something precious. His grandfather's legacy and a connection to family he'd thought he'd lost forever. The barn could be converted into something useful, maybe a workshop or studio. The house needed work, but the bones were solid. "I think Grandpa would want someone to love this place the way he did before everything got complicated," Jake said finally. "Maybe it's time to give it a chance to be just an island again." "Just an island," Sarah repeated, smiling. "No secret government operations, no mysterious surveillance equipment, just fishing and farming and fixing up old buildings. Sounds boring when you put it like that." "Sounds perfect." She kissed his cheek and headed toward the house. "I'll start making a list of everything that needs repairs. This place is going to need a lot of work if you want it livable before winter." Jake remained on the bench as the last boat disappeared beyond the horizon. The silence that settled over the island was different now, peaceful instead of ominous. His grandfather's watch ticked steadily against his wrist, no longer counting down to revelation, but simply marking the passage of time on a quiet island where secrets could finally rest. The adventure was over. The real work was just beginning.